God, I come before you today with a mind that feels like a storm-tossed sea, waves of worry crashing against the shores of my peace. You know how my thoughts spiral in the quiet hours, how they multiply like shadows in the evening light. I've tried to control them, to silence them with my own strength, but they return like persistent whispers in the night. You see me lying awake at 2 a.m., my mind racing through tomorrow's uncertainties, replaying conversations, imagining worst-case scenarios that steal my rest. Lord, I'm weary of this battle inside my head, this constant chatter that drowns out your gentle voice. Help me remember that you are bigger than every anxious thought, every fearful imagination that tries to take root in my mind. Today, I surrender these racing thoughts to you, trusting that your peace can calm even the most turbulent mental storms. Father, you understand the weight I carry when my mind won't quiet, when thoughts tumble over each other like rocks in an avalanche. I think about my children's futures until my chest tightens, worry about my marriage until sleep escapes me entirely. These thoughts feel so real, so urgent, as if thinking harder will somehow solve what only you can resolve. I've noticed how my mind creates problems that don't exist yet, borrowing trouble from tomorrow's unknown hours. You know how I rehearse difficult conversations that may never happen, how I plan for disasters that exist only in my imagination. Lord, I confess that my anxious thinking has become a prison I've built with my own fears and assumptions. Break these mental chains that bind me to worry, that keep me captive to thoughts that serve no good purpose. Replace my anxious imagination with your perfect truth, my fearful projections with your faithful promises that never fail. God, I remember Sarah from church who always seemed so peaceful, and I wondered what secret she possessed that I lacked. Then she shared how her mind used to race just like mine, how she would lie in bed creating elaborate worry scenarios about her teenager's choices. She told me how she learned to catch those thoughts before they spiraled, how she began speaking your word over her fears instead of feeding them with more anxious thinking. Lord, I want that same freedom she found, that same ability to redirect my mind toward your truth rather than my fears. You've shown me through her testimony that anxious thoughts don't have to define my daily experience, that peace is possible even for minds like mine. Help me develop new patterns of thinking, new habits that honor you rather than honor my fears and worries. Teach me to recognize when my thoughts are serving anxiety rather than serving you, when my mental energy is building problems rather than building faith. Lord, my grandmother used to say that worry was like a rocking chair. It gave you something to do but never got you anywhere. I think about her words when my mind gets stuck in those endless loops of anxious thinking, going over the same concerns without reaching any resolution. You know how exhausting it becomes to think the same worried thoughts day after day, like walking in circles in a maze with no exit. I've realized that my anxious thoughts often masquerade as problem-solving, but they're really just mental quicksand that pulls me deeper into fear. Help me distinguish between productive thinking that leads to wise action and anxious thinking that only feeds my worries. When my mind begins that familiar spiral of what-if scenarios, remind me to pause and ask whether these thoughts are serving your purposes or serving my fears. Give me the wisdom to know when to think and when to simply trust, when to plan and when to rest in your sovereignty. Father, I confess that sometimes my anxious thoughts feel safer than surrendering control to you, as if worrying somehow prepares me for disappointment. I've made worry my companion, treating anxious thinking like a protective shield against life's uncertainties. But you're showing me that this kind of thinking actually weakens my faith rather than strengthening my preparedness for challenges. You know how I sometimes pride myself on being a thorough thinker, someone who considers all possibilities, but you're revealing how this can become an idol of control. I don't want my mind to be a playground for fear anymore, a place where worst-case scenarios get more attention than your best promises. Help me understand that thoughtful planning is different from anxious obsessing, that wisdom includes knowing when enough consideration is enough. Transform my relationship with uncertainty from anxiety-inducing to faith-building, from fear-based to trust-centered. God, you see how my anxious thoughts affect not just me but my entire family, how my mental unrest creates ripples in my home's atmosphere. My children sense when I'm caught in worry cycles, when my mind is elsewhere wrestling with fears about their safety, their futures, their choices. You know how guilt compounds my anxiety when I realize my worried thoughts are stealing my presence from the people I love most. I want to model peace for my daughters, to show them what it looks like to trust you with life's uncertainties rather than being consumed by them. Help me break generational patterns of anxious thinking that may have been passed down through my family line, choosing instead to pass down a legacy of faith and trust. When my thoughts begin racing toward worst-case scenarios about my family, remind me to speak blessings over them instead of rehearsing my fears. Let my mind become a place where hope grows stronger than worry, where trust in you overcomes every anxious imagination. Lord, I think about Martha in the Bible, how she was anxious and troubled about many things while Mary chose the better part by sitting at your feet. You know how my mind often feels like Martha's heart, pulled in many directions, worried about so many details that I miss your presence. I've been so busy thinking about life that I've forgotten to actually live it, so focused on future problems that I've missed present blessings. You're calling me to choose the Mary heart, to quiet my anxious thoughts by spending time in your presence rather than in my worries. Help me understand that peace isn't the absence of challenges but the presence of your spirit calming my racing mind. When thoughts of tomorrow's uncertainties begin to overwhelm today's grace, draw me back to this moment where your peace is available. Teach me to value stillness with you more than the false productivity of endless anxious thinking. Father, you know the physical toll that anxious thoughts take on my body. The tight chest, the sleepless nights, the knots in my stomach when worry takes over. My mind and body are connected in ways I'm only beginning to understand, and you created both to work in harmony rather than in the discord that anxiety creates. I've noticed how certain anxious thoughts trigger physical responses that make the anxiety feel even more real and urgent than it actually is. Help me recognize these patterns and interrupt them with your truth before they spiral into panic or overwhelm. You designed my nervous system to respond to real threats, not imaginary ones created by anxious thinking, yet I've trained it to react to my worried thoughts as if they were actual emergencies. Restore the natural rhythm you intended between my mind and body, where peace in my thoughts translates to calm in my physical being. Let your spirit breathe through me, slowing my racing heart and relaxing the tension that worry creates in my muscles and my soul. God, I remember reading about how the Israelites worried about food in the wilderness even though you provided manna every single day without fail. Their anxious thoughts about tomorrow's provision made them miss today's miracle, and I see myself in their story so clearly. You've provided for me every day of my life, yet my mind still races with worry about future needs, future problems, future scenarios that may never come to pass. You know how I rehearse conversations about asking for help, how I imagine being unable to pay bills, how I create detailed worst-case scenarios about losing what you've given me. Help me remember your faithfulness in my past when anxious thoughts about the future begin to overwhelm my present peace. Just as you provided manna daily for the Israelites, you provide daily grace for my daily needs, including the need for a peaceful mind. When worry whispers that you might not come through this time, let me remember every previous time you've proven that whisper wrong. For those watching, there's a special ebook in our pinned comment called Don't Think, Trust and Surrender that can help ease anxiety symptoms. Remember, this complements but doesn't replace professional guidance. Lord, you understand how social media and news feeds fuel my anxious thoughts, how constant information about everyone else's highlight reels makes my mind race with comparison and inadequacy. I scroll through perfect families, successful careers, beautiful homes, and my thoughts spiral into worry about my own life's imperfections. You see how I consume stories of tragedy and crisis until my mind becomes convinced that disaster is lurking around every corner of my own life. Help me be more intentional about what I allow into my mental space, recognizing that my anxious thoughts often feed on the very content I choose to consume. When I find myself mindlessly scrolling and feeling my anxiety increase, remind me to close the app and open your word instead. Let me be as careful about my mental diet as I am about my physical diet, choosing inputs that nourish peace rather than feed fear. Guard my mind from the comparison trap that social media creates, helping me remember that everyone's real life includes struggles that don't make it into their curated online presence. Father, my friend Jessica told me how she used to wake up every morning with her mind already racing through the day's potential problems before her feet even hit the floor. She described it perfectly. How anxious thoughts could hijack her entire day before it even began, stealing her joy and her peace from the very first moments of consciousness. You know how I relate to her experience, how my own mind sometimes starts spinning worry cycles while I'm still in bed, rehearsing all the things that could go wrong today. But she also shared how she learned to redirect those first thoughts toward gratitude and trust. How she trained her mind to start each day with your promises instead of her fears. Help me develop that same discipline, to make my first conscious thoughts of each day thoughts of your goodness rather than thoughts of potential problems. When I wake up tomorrow morning, let my mind naturally turn toward thanksgiving for another day of your mercies rather than anxiety about another day of uncertainties. God, you see how my anxious thoughts often disguise themselves as spiritual concerns, how I worry about my children's faith, my husband's salvation, my family's spiritual growth with an intensity that creates more anxiety than action. I tell myself this worry is love, that it's responsible Christian motherhood, but you're showing me how it can become a form of control disguised as care. You know my heart's desire for my family to know you, but you're teaching me that anxious thoughts about their spiritual journeys don't actually draw them closer to you. Help me distinguish between Holy Spirit conviction that leads to prayer and action from anxious thoughts that only lead to more worry and stress. When I find myself mentally rehearsing all the ways my loved ones might fall away from faith, redirect those thoughts toward prayers of blessing and trust. Let my concern for their souls be expressed through intercession rather than anxiety, through faithful example rather than fearful obsessing. Lord, I think about how Jesus slept peacefully in the boat during the storm while the disciples panicked around him. And I wonder what it would feel like to have that kind of mental rest in life's storms. You know how my mind becomes like those disciples, immediately catastrophizing when circumstances feel uncertain, assuming the worst when situations look challenging. My anxious thoughts often make me feel like I'm drowning in problems that haven't even happened yet, like I'm fighting battles that exist only in my imagination. Help me develop the same trust that allowed Jesus to sleep through the storm, the deep confidence that you are in control even when life feels chaotic. When my thoughts begin racing toward panic about situations beyond my control, remind me that you are the same God who calmed the winds and the waves with just a word. Let your peace be so real in my mind that anxious thoughts lose their power to disturb my spiritual equilibrium. Father, you understand how perfectionism feeds my anxious thoughts, how the fear of making mistakes keeps my mind spinning with worry about every decision, every choice, every possible outcome. I rehearse conversations to make sure I say the right thing, overthink simple decisions until they become overwhelming, second-guess myself until confidence becomes impossible. You know how this mental habit of trying to think through every possibility actually paralyzes me rather than preparing me for success. Help me embrace the truth that you don't require perfection from me, that you can work through my imperfect decisions and even my mistakes for good. When my mind begins the familiar pattern of overanalyzing every choice, remind me that you are big enough to guide my steps even when I can't see the whole staircase. Let me trust your guidance more than my own ability to think through every possible scenario and outcome. God, I confess that my anxious thoughts often center around the people I love most, imagining terrible things happening to them, rehearsing how I would cope with loss or tragedy. You see how love and worry have become tangled in my heart, how caring deeply has somehow translated into thinking anxiously about all the ways I could lose what matters most. I lie awake imagining phone calls with bad news, hospital visits, accidents, illnesses, scenarios that steal my peace and rob me of enjoying the relationships you've blessed me with today. Help me understand that love doesn't require anxiety, that I can care deeply without thinking fearfully, that my worried thoughts about my loved ones don't actually protect them in any way. When my mind begins creating disaster scenarios involving my family, redirect those thoughts toward prayers of blessing and protection instead. Let my love for them be expressed through trust in your care rather than through anxious mental rehearsals of potential tragedies. Lord, you know how my anxious thoughts often involve money and provision, how I calculate and recalculate budgets in my mind, imagining financial disasters and economic collapse. I think about job loss, unexpected expenses, retirement savings, college funds, And my mind creates elaborate worst-case scenarios that make me feel poor even when my needs are currently met. You see how I sometimes lie awake doing mental math about bills and expenses, borrowing trouble from future months and years that haven't arrived yet. Help me remember that you are my provider, that you know my needs before I even voice them, that you have never failed to take care of your children who trust in you. When thoughts of financial ruin begin to spiral in my mind, remind me of your promise to supply all my needs according to your riches in glory. Let me find my security in your faithfulness rather than in my ability to think through every possible financial scenario and solution. Father, I think about David writing Psalms when his mind was troubled, how he poured out his anxious thoughts to you and found his way back to trust and praise. You know how journaling sometimes helps me process my worried thoughts, how writing them down makes them seem less overwhelming than when they're just spinning in my head. But I also know that dwelling on anxious thoughts, even in writing, can sometimes make them stronger rather than weaker if I'm not careful. Help me learn to process my mental struggles in ways that lead to peace rather than more anxiety, to express my concerns in ways that honor you rather than feed my fears. When I need to work through anxious thoughts, lead me to your word and to wise counsel rather than to endless rumination that goes nowhere productive. Let my processing always end where David's Psalms ended, in remembrance of your goodness and recommitment to trusting your perfect plan. God, you see how comparison feeds my anxious thoughts, how looking at other women who seem to have it all together makes my mind race with worry about my own inadequacies. I watch mothers who appear more patient, wives who seem more supportive, women who look more put together, and my thoughts spiral into anxiety about all the ways I'm falling short. You know how social gatherings sometimes trigger hours of mental replay afterward, analyzing every conversation, every interaction, wondering what others thought about me, my children, my responses. Help me remember that you didn't create me to be like anyone else, that comparison truly is the thief of joy and the creator of unnecessary anxiety. When my mind begins the familiar pattern of measuring my life against someone else's highlight reel, redirect those thoughts toward gratitude for the unique way you've designed me and my family. Let me find my identity in your love rather than in how I measure up to other people's perceived perfection. Lord, you understand how my anxious thoughts often involve my children's futures, their education, their friendships, their character development, their safety in a world that sometimes seems so dangerous. I lie awake thinking about bullying, academic pressure, peer influence, technology dangers, college applications, career choices that are still years away. You see how my love for them translates into mental scenarios where I try to prepare for every possible challenge they might face, every potential harm that could come their way. Help me remember that you love them even more than I do, that you have good plans for their lives that don't require my anxious oversight to unfold successfully. When my mind begins creating worst-case scenarios about their futures, remind me to pray blessings over them instead of rehearsing my fears about them. Let me trust you with their stories while I focus on being present for the chapters we're living together today. Father, I confess how my anxious thoughts sometimes make me short-tempered with the people I love most. How mental stress leaks out into my interactions and relationships. You know how worry makes me less patient, less present, less able to extend grace when my family needs it most from me. I snap at my husband over small things when I'm really stressed about big things. Lose patience with my children's normal childhood behaviors when my mind is spinning with adult concerns. You see how anxiety becomes a thief that steals not just my peace but also my ability to love well in the moments that matter most. Help me recognize when anxious thoughts are affecting my relationships, when my mental stress is creating relational stress that hurts the people I care about most. When I feel that familiar tension building from worried thoughts, help me pause and breathe your peace before I speak or react in ways I'll later regret. God, you know how my mind sometimes gets stuck in loops of regret about past decisions, anxiously replaying conversations and choices, wondering how things might have been different if I had chosen differently. I think about parenting moments I wish I could redo, words I wish I could take back, opportunities one wish I had taken, relationships I wish I had handled better. You see how these anxious thoughts about the past steal energy from the present moments where I actually have the power to make different choices. Help me understand that regret is just anxiety turned backward, that rehashing past decisions doesn't change their outcomes but does rob me of present peace. When my mind begins the familiar spiral of, what if I had, or if only I had, remind me that your mercies are new every morning, that your grace covers my past mistakes and your wisdom guides my future choices. Let me learn from the past without living in it, growing from experience without being trapped by regret. Lord, you understand how hormones and seasons of life affect my mental patterns. How certain times of the month or year make anxious thoughts feel more overwhelming and harder to control. You see how perimenopause has intensified my worry patterns. How lack of sleep makes every concern feel more urgent and every problem seem bigger than it actually is. You know how physical changes in my body create changes in my mind that sometimes catch me off guard with their intensity. Help me extend grace to myself during seasons when anxious thoughts feel stronger, when my usual coping strategies don't seem as effective as they normally are. When hormonal shifts make my mind more vulnerable to worry and fear, remind me that this too is temporary, that you are constant even when my internal chemistry fluctuates. Let me be patient with myself during these seasons while still taking practical steps to care for both my physical and mental well-being. Father, I think about how technology has changed the way my mind processes information, how constant notifications and instant communication have trained my brain to expect immediate responses and solutions. You see how this affects my prayer life too, how I sometimes expect instant peace when I bring my anxious thoughts to you, becoming frustrated when the mental shift takes time and patience. I've noticed how the same device that connects me to your word and Christian encouragement also connects me to news cycles and social media that fuel my anxious thinking patterns. Help me be more intentional about using technology in ways that support peace rather than anxiety, setting boundaries that protect my mental space from information overload. When I reach for my phone out of habit or boredom, remind me to reach for your presence instead, to choose inputs that calm my mind rather than stimulate more worried thoughts. God, you know how control and anxiety are connected in my heart, how my anxious thoughts often stem from situations where I feel powerless to influence outcomes that matter deeply to me. I think obsessively about my husband's health, my children's choices, my parents' aging, my own future, trying to mentally manage situations that are ultimately in your hands alone. You see how exhausting it becomes to carry mental responsibility for outcomes I can't actually control. How worry becomes my way of trying to feel like I'm doing something productive about uncertain situations. Help me distinguish between my sphere of influence and my sphere of concern, investing my mental energy in actions I can take rather than anxious thoughts about results I can't guarantee. When I find my mind spinning with worry about things beyond my control, redirect that energy toward prayer and trust, toward accepting what I cannot change while faithfully managing what I can. Lord, you understand how my anxious thoughts often involve worst-case scenarios about my marriage, imagining conflict, disappointment, growing apart, or loss that makes me feel like I need to control outcomes through worry. I replay difficult conversations, analyze my husband's moods, overthink small disagreements until they become big problems in my mind. You see how this mental habit actually creates some of the tension I'm worried about. How anxiety becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that damages the very relationship I'm trying to protect through my concerned thoughts. Help me trust you with my marriage, bringing my concerns to you in prayer rather than turning them into anxious mental rehearsals that serve no good purpose. When thoughts about my relationship begin spiraling toward fear, remind me of your faithfulness in bringing us together and your power to help us grow together in love. Let me invest more energy in loving my husband well today than in worrying about potential problems tomorrow. Father, I confess how my anxious thoughts sometimes masquerade as wisdom or discernment. How I tell myself that thinking through every possible negative outcome is just being prepared and responsible. You know how pride can disguise itself as anxiety. How my need to feel mentally prepared for any scenario can become a way of trusting my own understanding rather than leaning on you. I've realized that some of my worried thinking is actually a form of trying to control outcomes through mental preparation, as if thinking hard enough about problems will somehow prevent them from happening. Help me distinguish between wise planning that leads to appropriate action and anxious thinking that only leads to more worry and stress. When I catch my mind in those familiar patterns of overthinking every possibility, remind me that true wisdom includes knowing when enough consideration is enough, and when it's time to simply trust your guidance. God, you see how my anxious thoughts affect my physical health, how stress hormones from mental worry create real symptoms in my body that then create more anxiety in a cycle that feels impossible to break. I've noticed how my neck tenses when I'm overthinking, how my stomach churns when I'm mentally rehearsing worst-case scenarios, how my sleep suffers when my mind won't quiet down at bedtime. You designed my body and mind to work in harmony, but anxiety disrupts that natural rhythm you intended for my overall well-being. Help me recognize the early warning signs when anxious thoughts are beginning to affect my physical health, taking practical steps to interrupt those patterns before they become overwhelming. When I feel physical symptoms of mental stress, remind me that this is my body's way of asking for the peace that only you can provide. Let your presence calm not just my thoughts but also the physical tension that worry creates in my muscles, my breathing, and my nervous system. Lord, you know how perfectionism in my home creates anxious thoughts about never being organized enough, clean enough, or put together enough for unexpected visitors or social media posts. I think about all the projects that remain unfinished, all the areas that need attention, all the ways my home doesn't measure up to Pinterest perfect standards that exist nowhere in real life. You see how this mental pressure steals joy from the very space you've blessed me with. How worry about my home's imperfections keeps me from enjoying the haven you've provided. Help me remember that my home's purpose is to serve my family's needs, not to impress other people or meet impossible standards of perfection. When thoughts about household inadequacies begin creating stress rather than motivation, remind me that hospitality is about heart, not about having everything perfectly arranged and spotlessly clean. Let me find peace in a home that shows signs of being lived in and loved in rather than anxiety about spaces that don't match magazine photographs. Father, I think about how Jesus told his disciples not to worry about tomorrow because today has enough troubles of its own, and I realize how much mental energy I waste borrowing problems from future days that haven't arrived yet. You know how my mind creates elaborate scenarios about next week, next month, next year, spinning stories about problems that may never materialize while missing the grace you've provided for today. I've noticed how this mental time travel to future difficulties robs me of present peace, how anxiety about tomorrow steals the strength I need for today's actual challenges. Help me stay mentally present in the day you've given me, trusting that when tomorrow comes, you'll provide tomorrow's grace for tomorrow's needs. When my thoughts begin racing toward future scenarios, both good and bad, anchor me in this moment where your presence is available and your peace is sufficient. Let me live one day at a time rather than trying to mentally live through multiple possible futures simultaneously. God, you understand how my anxious thoughts often center around my health and my family's health, how every unusual symptom becomes a worst-case scenario in my mind, every news story about illness becomes a personal fear. I think about aging, disease, accidents, and loss until my mind creates more symptoms from stress than my body actually has from any real health concern. You see how I sometimes avoid medical appointments because I'm afraid of what I might discover, yet also research symptoms online until I've convinced myself of dire diagnoses that likely don't exist. Help me find the balance between responsible health awareness and anxious health obsession, between appropriate medical care and fearful hypochondria. When thoughts about health begin spiraling into panic, remind me that you hold every breath, every heartbeat, every day of my life in your sovereign hands. Let me trust your timing for my life while taking reasonable care of the body you've given me without letting health anxiety steal my peace or my joy. Lord, you know how financial anxiety creates elaborate mental calculations about budgets, savings, retirement, and economic uncertainty that keep my mind spinning with worry about provision and security. I think about job stability, market crashes, inflation, unexpected expenses, and my mind creates detailed disaster scenarios about poverty and need that may never come to pass. You see how these anxious thoughts about money often reveal where I've placed my trust. In my own ability to earn and save rather than in your promise to provide for your children. Help me remember that you fed the 5,000 with a boy's lunch, that you provided manna in the wilderness, that you have never failed to meet the needs of those who trust in you. When thoughts about financial security begin creating insecurity in my mind, remind me that my true treasure is stored in heaven where no economic downturn can touch it. Let me be a wise steward of what you've entrusted to me without being anxious about what only you can ultimately provide and protect. Father, I confess how my anxious thoughts sometimes make me question your goodness, how worry whispers that you might not come through for me this time, that your track record of faithfulness doesn't guarantee future provision. You know how anxiety erodes trust. How fearful thinking makes me forget all the ways you've already proven your love and care in my life story. I think about all the times I've worried about situations that resolved much better than my anxious mind had imagined. All the provisions that came just when I needed them. All the doors that opened just when I thought I was trapped. Help me build a stronger mental library of your faithfulness that I can access when anxiety tries to convince me that this time will be different. This problem will be too big for your power. When worried thoughts begin suggesting that you might abandon me or forget my needs, flood my mind with memories of your consistent goodness throughout my life. Let my knowledge of who you are be stronger than my anxious imagination of what might go wrong. God, you see how my mind sometimes gets trapped in cycles of worry about my adult children. How empty nest syndrome has translated into anxious thinking about their choices, their relationships, their spiritual walks, their future decisions. I lie awake wondering if I taught them enough, prepared them adequately, modeled faith effectively during their growing up years at home. You know how this mental reviewing of my parenting creates more anxiety than insight, more regret than resolution, more worry than wisdom about how to relate to them now. Help me trust that the seeds I planted in their hearts during childhood are still growing even when I can't see the evidence, that your spirit is working in their lives even when they make choices I wouldn't make. When thoughts about their decisions begin creating stress in my mind, remind me that they are your children even more than they are mine, that you love them more perfectly than I ever could. Let me support their adult journeys with prayer and encouragement rather than with anxiety and attempts to control outcomes I can no longer influence. Lord, you understand how social anxiety creates worried thoughts about upcoming gatherings, events, and interactions with people who know me in different contexts and seasons of life. I rehearse conversations that may never happen, imagine awkward moments that may never occur, worry about saying the wrong thing or not knowing what to say at all. You see how this mental preparation often increases my anxiety rather than decreasing it. How overthinking social situations makes them more stressful rather than more successful. Help me remember that most people are thinking about themselves more than they're analyzing my words, actions, or appearance, that the awkward moments I imagine are usually much bigger in my mind than in reality. When thoughts about social situations begin creating dread rather than anticipation, remind me that you go with me into every interaction, every gathering, every conversation. Let me focus more on being present with people than on being perfect in my social performance, more on loving others well than on managing their opinions of me. Father, I think about how my anxious thoughts often involve comparing my children to other people's children, wondering if they're developing properly, achieving enough, making good choices, fitting in appropriately with their peer groups. You know how school events, social media posts, and conversations with other parents can trigger hours of worried thinking about whether my kids are measuring up to invisible standards that exist nowhere except in my own mind. I replay interactions, analyze their behavior, second-guess my parenting decisions, and create elaborate plans to address problems that may not actually exist. Help me see my children through your eyes rather than through the lens of comparison and competition that our culture creates around childhood achievement and development. When thoughts about their progress begin creating anxiety rather than appropriate concern, remind me that you have unique plans for each of their lives that don't depend on how they compare to anyone else's timeline or achievements. Let me celebrate who they are rather than worrying about who they're not yet, trusting your design for their individual personalities and gifts. God, you know how my anxious thoughts sometimes focus on my own aging, how changes in my body, my energy, my appearance create worry about losing vitality, relevance, and independence as the years pass. I think about my parents' struggles with health and mobility, and my mind creates scenarios about my own future limitations that steal peace from my present capabilities. You see how our culture's obsession with youth makes aging feel like failure rather than the natural progression of life that you've designed with purpose and dignity. Help me embrace each season of life with grace rather than anxiety, finding beauty in maturity rather than only mourning the passing of younger years. When thoughts about aging begin creating fear rather than acceptance, remind me that you have plans for my later years that are as meaningful as your plans for my earlier years. Let me trust your timeline for my life while taking good care of my health without being anxious about changes I cannot control or prevent. Lord, you understand how technology creates new forms of anxiety in my mind. Worry about online safety for my family, concern about screen time and digital addiction, overwhelmed from information overload that previous generations never faced. I think about identity theft, cyberbullying, inappropriate content, privacy violations, and my mind creates elaborate fears about digital dangers that feel both very real and completely beyond my ability to control. You see how the same tools that connect me to encouragement and information also connect me to news cycles and social comparisons that fuel anxious thinking patterns I didn't have before smartphones and social media. Help me navigate this digital age with wisdom rather than anxiety, setting appropriate boundaries without being paralyzed by fear of technology's potential dangers. When thoughts about online risks begin creating panic rather than prudent caution, remind me that you are sovereign over every aspect of our modern world, including the digital spaces where my family and I spend time. Let me use technology as a tool for good while trusting you with the risks that come with living in this connected age. Father, I confess how my anxious thoughts often reveal my lack of trust in your timing, how I worry that good things will never happen for me, that prayers will never be answered, that situations will never improve beyond their current difficult state. You know how impatience masquerades as anxiety in my heart, how my desire for resolution creates mental pressure that makes waiting feel impossible rather than purposeful. I think about unanswered prayers, delayed dreams, ongoing struggles, and my mind creates scenarios where nothing ever changes, where hope becomes foolishness rather than faith. Help me remember that your timing is perfect even when it doesn't match my preferences, that delays in my timeline don't indicate absence in your plans. When thoughts about your timing begin creating despair rather than anticipation, remind me of all the times you've worked behind the scenes in ways I couldn't see, preparing answers I couldn't imagine through circumstances I didn't understand. Let me trust your schedule for my life while finding peace in whatever season I'm currently experiencing under your loving care. As I bring these anxious thoughts to you today, Lord, I feel your peace beginning to settle over my mind like morning dew on troubled ground. You've heard every worry, every fear, every racing thought that has stolen my sleep and robbed my joy, and you receive them all with perfect understanding and infinite compassion. I don't have to carry these mental burdens alone anymore, don't have to solve every problem through anxious thinking, don't have to control outcomes through worried preparation that serves no good purpose. You're teaching me new patterns of thinking, new habits of trust, new responses to uncertainty that honor you rather than honor my fears and anxious imaginations. When tomorrow brings new challenges that could trigger old patterns of worried thinking, help me remember this moment of surrender, this choice to trust your goodness rather than rehearse my fears. Let your peace guard my heart and mind in Christ Jesus, protecting my thoughts from anxiety's lies and filling my mental space with truth, hope, and confidence in your perfect love. If this prayer has touched your heart, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear these words of hope and peace today.